kind of dive into the concepts of cybersecurity readiness and some of the key pillars that we think of when we work within our organization or with other organizations to ensure that they're prepared in the event of a cyber attack. So I'd like to start by looking at some other examples of industries where concepts of readiness, continuous improvement, and training are really prevalent. We have ERs and a trauma surgeon as an example. They perform highly specialized surgeries with little or no warning, little or no time, right? A tremendous amount of pressure. And as you'll see with all of these, life and death circumstances. Military analogies are sometimes overused in cybersecurity, but in this context, I find it instructive. We often talk about special forces being able to execute missions with surgical precision. And we expect feats from them a lot of the time that seem impossible. And we ask that they deliver at this level over and over and over again with no mistakes. And these folks aren't superhuman. They weren't born spinal surgeons. They weren't born elite soldiers or airmen. These people do the things that they do by training for years just for those opportunities. And they never stop learning, training, improving, and pushing the limits of what they can do, what's possible. Readiness in both of these professions is, in its own way, the difference between life and death. Lastly, for police and first responders, I tend to find the most parallels with what we do in cybersecurity. A lot of their days and a lot of the calls they get are the same. And they prepare for those for the sake of safety and efficiency, a lot like us. But a lot like us, some days aren't going to end up like all the others. Their mission is to protect and their mission is to help. But they also have to face the realities of some very adversarial and emotionally charged situations. So I'd like to tell a story in the context of police and first responders that I think illustrates some of these parallels well. So on September 19th of last year, on the heels of the school shootings in Uvalde, Texas, that really rocked the world, Denver East High School, which is a large high school, around 3,000 students, and about a mile from my house, they received a call from a teacher indicating that there was an active shooter. And to put that into context, the Denver public school system has hundreds of schools, I think almost 100,000 students. There are around 3,000 students and faculty at Denver East High School on any given day. So I want to walk through what the response to this looked like, and some of the parallels and also some of the opportunities that it presented. So the tactical response to this event, when that phone call came in, 1:53 p.m. it's when the caller made the called 911, indicated they were a teacher, active shooter at the school, and asked them to send help. So Denver Police Department has a 90-second service level objective for response to an imminent threat in the school. And again, this is over 200 schools and 90,000 students in a sizable metropolitan area. So within a minute, the school initiated their remote lockdown procedure. That can be done remotely by the public school system in coordination with the police. And so the school was locked down remotely. And the notification went out over the PA and other systems to students and faculty that they should shelter and wait. So within a minute, right? That's a really, that's an exceptionally fast response, and the response that you'd expect. 1:55 p.m. So within 2 minutes or less, the police are there. They've got officers on scene. They enter the school and they begin going from the top of the school to working their way, top to bottom, front to back. And there were probably 100+ first responders in minutes. So overall, 2 minutes, right? That's a really good tactical response, and keeping inside of the Denver Police Department's objective for being able to get to any school when a situation like this takes place in under 2 minutes. It's an aggressive target. So far, so good, right? Tactical response is on par with what we expect. So what happens next? So this is a security talk, right? And like we love us Twitter and social media. I use Twitter as a tool, as an example. I have push alerts set up for a bunch of important accounts. Helps me stay on top of breaking news and things like that. So Denver Police Department's one of them. So again, 1:53, police are notified. Within 2 minutes, the police are there on scene and engage. 16 minutes later, this gets posted to Twitter by the Denver Police Department, indicating there's a large presence. They say there's no report of injuries, and that's pretty standard for an initial announcement, right? So the thing I didn't mention previously is that my son is a sophomore at Denver East High School. So at the time this is happening, he's in his biology class a couple periods from the end of the day. So I get this notification. Good news, I found out. The bad news is that I found out about this from Twitter, which is not ideal, right? So I mentioned I live about a mile away. I'm just across the city park from the school. And at this point, I kind of poke my head outside. There are sirens screaming in every direction. I can see the helicopter up in the air over the park. So I jump in my car, I'm at school. There are, I mentioned before, right, hundreds of first responders. The school is completely surrounded. They've got a mobile incident command truck that's pulling up on scene. Denver Fire has got their ladder trucks out, and they're using that to try to get people a view into the upper floors of the school. This is a huge high school. And again, by and large, like a textbook tactical first response. So what happens next? 25 minutes after this ordeal begins, we finally hear from our son, and this is the message that we get, or part of it. So Twitter's telling me there's no problem. We haven't heard anything from the school or from the county, and we haven't heard anything from our son. And so 25 minutes after the saga begins, and 10 minutes after I found out about this via social media, we get this picture. Again, good news, bad news, right? Bad news is that there's a guy with a gun in his science class. Good news is it's one of the good guys, right? So at this point, we're happy that he's safe, but we're still like very confused. And so, like, despite the fact that I'm effectively on scene at this point, there's really no information at all, other than at this point a whole bunch of responses to the social media post and guesswork and conjecture. So next thing that happens, 47 minutes into the incident, this text message arrives, right? Telling us that we can reunify at the Martin Luther King statue that's off 17th Avenue. This is right in the park, kind of where all the parents and folks like that at this point are kind of like gathering. But it tells us, please don't proceed to the school. So like that request came in a little late. Remember, you've got thousands of students and faculty. Everyone's got a phone. In the absence of information, everyone's getting inaccurate or incomplete information. There's rumors swirling. But this is the first message that as a parent I received. So had I not received that notification from Twitter, and had I not been able to get in touch with our son, this is all the information I have to go off of. I have no idea, outside of that context that I happen to have, like there's a whole bunch of parents who have no clue why they just got this message. They don't know what they're reunifying from. They have no clue what's going on. 70 minutes later, we get this helpful notification. It tells us East High is in a lockdown. And again, please meet at the statue in City Park to await further details. This is 70 minutes into this incident, like thousands of students and faculty in this school, massive police presence. At this point, it's on the local news. There are helicopters everywhere, all of it, and just a tremendous amount of activity. 70 minutes later, we get notified the school's locked down. 91 minutes later, we receive the all clear. And it tells us that students will be dismissed. At this point, it's effectively the end of the day anyway. And so you can kind of see, if you look at this overall timeline of events, right? Things are a little bit out of order, and it took an hour and a half for the school system to effectively notify, parents, other loved ones, guardians, like faculty members, family and friends, like an hour and a half. That's an exceptional amount of time, right? And so when we look at this and kind of reflect, I like to use the NIST incident handling scorecard, and kind of those high level incident handling activities as a way to reflect on incidents and understand like how we did, right? And so this incident, despite a textbook tactical response and a good outcome, right? No one was harmed, was widely considered by everyone in the community to be a complete failure, right? Thousands of folks at risk, hundreds of first responders, and the communications in particular were poorly coordinated. They weren't timely, and they really added to confusion instead of providing clarity, right? So monitoring and handling, I think, again, looking at that tactical response, right where we wanted it to be. What didn't work was communication, right? Like the one thing that if you do it well, can really help to bring a lot of calm and a lot of order and really improve your response. We completely failed to do in this case, right? And so what's the lesson here? The lesson is you can expertly manage some aspects of an incident and you can still fail to adequately respond. In the context of cybersecurity, right, and cybersecurity readiness, you can be great at threat detection and you can like never miss the signal, but you can still fail to protect the organization when it matters most, right? At Red Canary, where we sit, really is a last line of defense for most of our customers. One of the things we learned early on is that you can be exceptional at threat detection, and we can do an amazing job making sure that like we're detecting adversaries, we're notifying our customers, or we're taking action on their behalf. But if we don't know what to do and it's not clearly communicated and working together, we don't do a good job communicating the state of the incident, next steps, who's responsible, who's in what role. Again, just like this incident I explained at the high school, it's really easy to add to confusion. And the downside consequence of that in a lot of cases is that you fail to respond to a thing that like you might have had a beat on. So how do we do better? So how do we identify those activities that help us mature our ability to detect and respond to adversaries? We start by understanding what's most important. In cybersecurity, this all starts with detection and response. How do we identify incidents? How do we handle them? And then once we've got a foundational detection and response capability in place, we want to make sure we're continuously improving that thing, right? The goal is to mature those core security functions, but also to operationalize and drive improvements within other aspects of risk management, right? So we want to build ultimately trust and confidence in our team, in our people, in our plans. We want to build trust and confidence in the technology that we depend on. And as a leader, I want trust and confidence in the investment that I've made in security products, partners, right? And really the question we're trying to answer is like, will this work when it matters, right? This model is illustrative, right? And so, the details matter less than the theme, which is that we want to bring testing, validation, and readiness activities at large to the fore. Like we want to focus on those things that when we really take a step back and think about the purpose and try to distill down the concept of readiness, this is what we want to do. We want to enhance foundational security practices that improve our defensive capabilities. Like this is how we think about readiness, and in particular, cybersecurity readiness in the context of an incident. Why do we care? For us at Red Canary, like this is why we care. We want to create a world where every organization can make their greatest impact without fear or damage from a cyber attack. Whether it's a telecommunications company, whether it's a children's hospital, whether it's a social media organization or a travel company, each of you has a why behind your organization and your mission, just like first responders have a why behind their mission and their purpose. And this is why this matters, right? Investing this time and making sure that we're collectively ready and that we're maturing our processes, and that we know these things will work when it matters. Like, that's why we do this, right? So let's talk about what we do and how we can prepare our teams together. So these are the pillars of cybersecurity readiness that we're going to talk through today. Scenarios, visibility, plans, and then how we can really use training and exercises to bring cohesion to all these things, again, to mature them, practice them, so that when we do have an incident or emergency, these things are muscle memory and not things that we're trying to learn on the fly, right? So let's start by looking at scenarios, right? Let's start by looking at what's likely to happen. In the context of cybersecurity, this means threats we're likely to face. One of the huge challenges that I've encountered in too many years in this industry is that we love to tell people, just refer to your threat model, think about your threat model. Threat modeling's tough, right? Like, that's a challenging exercise. Not every organization's set up well to do that. Organizations that do their own threat modeling and that take the time to understand that and kind of build that into how they work are absolutely going to benefit from it. But at the same time, we all here, like everyone watching this right now, uses Windows, uses Mac OS, uses Linux, AWS, Azure, like one of a small cross-section of technologies, right? And we know from experience here at Red Canary that, like, while every organization is very different, threats are 99% or more uniform, right? Despite those differences. So what does that mean? It means we kind of all have a baseline threat model that we can adopt just as a starting point. Like, this is not to say that this is the end, but all of these edge cases and all of these unique systems that everyone has, like, those are important to understand, right? That's all part of your attack surface, and it definitely factors into the risk that you have to manage. But the reality is there's a ton of commonality in the underlying technology, and therefore there's a ton of commonality in the threats that you're likely to encounter. Really simple examples of this, right? Taking a look at things like our threat detection report and looking at those top techniques that we see adversaries leverage successfully to try to gain access to customer environments year over year over year. Over 3 or 4 years now of producing this report, we've seen very little technique drift. A lot of the changes that we've seen in those top techniques have been largely a function of just better understanding the techniques themselves, things like MITRE and the attack framework breaking out sub-techniques to be a little bit more specific, but we don't see a ton of drift, right? And so these things are really well defined from a technique perspective. So, like, using this as part of your baseline threat model makes it very easy to understand. And ultimately, your ability to understand, detect, and respond to things like this, like at this technique level, is going to take you really, really far, right? These things are reused often. Similarly, we can look at the top threats that we face, right? These things, in some cases, are a single piece of technology. In some cases, it's an overall, like, it's a threat actor or it's a cluster of activity that we understand to be happening together. But the good news with these, again, like using this as part of your baseline threat model, is that a lot of these are readily available, like either for free or for a modest fee, meaning that you can get access to the same tools that adversaries are using against you, and you can take some time and you can understand them. And the ones that aren't readily available to defenders necessarily are better documented every day. Things like Qbot, Bootloader, SockGolish, right? Those types of threats aren't perfectly understood, but they're understood plenty well enough that we do understand the underlying techniques that those threats leverage. And we also understand that there's a ton of overlap. When I mentioned lack of drift, there's a ton of overlap in the techniques that these threats leverage. So, looking back at those top techniques, most of these threats are going to use those same techniques, and even a subset of them that are really prevalent, over and over and over again. So understanding these threats is important because like these things are going to help you. They're going to help you prioritize things like initial access vectors, right? Do I need to focus more on email? Do I need to focus more on remote monitoring and management? So takeaway here is like, there's this stuff that we all get to worry about, right? Initial access, phishing, exploiting public facing applications, drive-by compromise, things like that. From a tooling perspective, referring back to some of the, some of those threats on the previous screen that are like tools, right? Cobalt Strike, Mimikatz, Metasploit. These are things we hear about frequently. And then obviously the objectives, right? Ransomware and other types of extortion and account takeover, business email compromise. So this is the type of thing when you think about a baseline threat model, you can take a very data-driven approach to that with techniques or threats that are prevalent. You can abstract that a little bit and look at it this way. And you can choose which one of that, the subset of those that you want to focus on most, right? For the purposes of, figuring out how to ensure that we're ready and like best prepared and know where to focus our training, know where to do things like drill and exercise. Like we could even say, let's focus on initial access and let's focus on objectives, right? Let's understand these things really well. And let's make sure that we know what to do when these things happen. So wrapping this up, right? Questions you want to ask. What threats are we most likely to face? Again, figuring out like what that baseline threat model is that you're willing to adopt if you don't already have one. And then where are those things going to materialize first, right? Particularly those initial access vectors. Like where are the earliest signals that you're going to have that something's going awry? And then understanding the actions you're going to take, right? A great resource for this is our threat detection report that's linked here. So both the techniques and the threats that we've kind of talked through and a ton of related information that's very useful for detection and response can be found in there. So now let's shift and talk about visibility. How are you going to know that something bad has happened in the first place? I mentioned earlier that we look at detection response as being foundational, right? Those are like a good detection and response capability is the foundation that you're going to build and mature on for years and years to come. And that really hinges on knowing that you have an incident in the first place, right? So, looking at this timeline, like the most important thing we need to be able to do is to detect those incidents, and then we can kick off the rest of these processes. That's not easy, right? We've got a ton of moving parts in a modern enterprise. We've got a lot of our corporate environment, traditional infrastructure, end user workstations, networking equipment for those, for companies that have physical facilities, all the things that come with that. But we've also got a bunch of, cloud-based infrastructure and applications. And of course, we've got the identities, right? Devices and users that are kind of the context in which we look at all of these things, right? Like how are they being used, by whom, and is this normal? So principally, detecting things sooner is better than later, right? So we want to seek those earliest indicators of malicious activity. When I mentioned, earlier, we talked about starting with initial access and just understanding like how adversaries get into an environment, right? So we want to seek those early indicators. We want to leverage attack and open source reporting. And then we want to isolate the data sources and those corresponding detection opportunities that we have, right? We kind of dig into initial access a little bit here, and we see phishing, right? Where do you get those signals? You're going to get those from application logs. You're going to get them from file creation events, network traffic. When you're looking at exploits, you're going to have things like application logs. Again, you'll see some commonality here. Network traffic, at that point, it's more to identify whether there's command and control taking place. Process behaviors is a really big one here, right? So in general, like we know from looking at attack that, process data is probably one of, if not the most common signal that we use to detect like threats with a high degree of accuracy. And then you've got things like drive-by downloads, right? And again, you're going to look at some of those same data sources here. So similar to, there being not a lot of drift in the types of techniques that adversaries use, there's actually not a lot of drift in like the high value data sources that we use to defend. So in the context of visibility, right, again, like questions you want to ask is like, would we know if one of these like highly prevalent initial access techniques took place, right? This is where you kind of have those concepts of visibility and observability, and just knowing that, you've taken the time to map these early stage, like these initial access techniques, mapping those to the underlying data sources, like things like just ensuring that you have visibility. And then on top of that visibility, now you can build detection, right? And ensure that you're getting some signal when an adversary shows up knocking on your door. Link to a blog here that just kind of talks a little bit about that, like a framework for building like some of that mapping, right? Taking threats, the techniques they leverage, and then like ways that you can test those and validate that things like your visibility and your observability are in place. Now let's talk about plans. Let's talk about what you're going to do when an incident occurs. This is one of my favorite books, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. And one of the things he says is that under conditions of complexity, not only are checklists a help, they're required for success. One of the other things that the theme that comes up in there is that like checklists are referred to as a mechanism of protection against failure, right? So in this particular book, the author's talking about how they ensure continuous improvement and avoid some common pitfalls in places like an ER, right? In like looking at the way that surgeons perform and why some perform so much better than others. And can't stress this enough, right? Incidents they're emotionally charged. By definition, they're almost always some form of surprise. And so even though you might have a tremendous amount of expertise and you might have, all of your plans really well documented, like in cybersecurity in particular, like we're dealing with an adversarial situation, right? So, despite our best laid plans, like there's an intelligent adversary on their side who's actively working to counter us. And so what we do want to do is like, we want these checklists to make sure we don't skip important steps, right? And we don't overlook obvious things. That said, like we also need to be flexible, right? So like these things tend to be minimalist, and I'm going to kind of look at some of the like key things that you want in place that just help keep your overall response on the rails, right? So in this case, first thing we want to do when we have an incident is we want to identify the type of incident severity, right? This is a common, although somewhat illustrative example of incident severity, right? Tend to start with like a Sev3, which is lower severity. These are, I've referred to them as investigative leads here, right? These are, alerts from your security products, right? So like early warning signals. Obviously, you learn over time how to prioritize those differently. But you don't need to respond to every one of them that second. It's not practical. It's just not possible. You also don't want to, let them sit or dwell for too long. And then as you move up, your Sev2 are the things that you need to look at in minutes, right? So this is signal that you've learned over time is like highly actionable, typically accurate. Sev1 tends to be, how organizations refer to effectively an all hands on deck incident of different sorts. Then you want defined roles, right? So when these incidents take place, like understanding who's involved, either individual level, team level, other stakeholders. For most organizations, stakeholders include things like shareholders, your board, your customers, of course, right? And these roles are absolutely critical to effective incident response, right? And you can see here, like this starts all like can go all the way to the top for those Sev1 incidents, right? Like at that point, you've likely engaged legal counsel, insurance, an incident response firm, right? And so like these aren't all the roles that exist, but understanding those roles and just taking some time to identify them and making sure those individuals know that they have that role in the event of a certain type of incident is really important. You want clear accountability. We've got a great resource out there in our incident response guide that breaks down how to use this concept of a RACI chart, right? And this just tells you, who's either directly responsible in a decision-making capacity for certain roles under certain circumstances, who just needs to be informed that a certain thing is happening, and so on and so forth, right? And like these can be really, really simple. Like you can start, like the beauty of things like a RACI chart is that you can start with a really, really simple breakdown of accountability and a really small number of dimensions. And over time, as your team and your understanding of these things improve, you can continue to build that out. Last thing is having easy to use playbooks, right? Can't stress this enough. And I mentioned before that these are your checklists in effect, right? At least insofar as that tactical or technical response is concerned. So in this case, looking at what we're going to do when we get a suspicious email, like what is our checklist? That's not to say that in certain types of cases, again, this is adversarial, it's fast moving. These things don't always look the same. Their capabilities and intent changes over time. But this is kind of like your framework, right? Like this just ensures that when there's a lot of other stuff going on, like you don't forget to take some of these key steps along the way that and therefore have taken time to document because they provide value. They're important decision-making criteria. They're important for helping to scope or prioritize or assign the severity to an incident. So just to reflect on that for a minute, understanding who's involved, understanding what type of incident you've got, and then understanding what you're going to do, right? Like how are you going to respond to a phishing attack? And taking those few actions, right? And just identifying incident types and severity, establishing clear roles and accountability. In our case, suggest using a RACI chart, and then having playbooks in place. Super important. Our incident response guide here linked at the bottom has a ton of information and also like a downloadable RACI chart tool that you can take and customize on your own. Lastly, let's look at training and exercises. So we've got these scenarios, we understand the threats we're most likely to face, and oftentimes just adopting a baseline threat model based on open source reporting. We've taken some time to make sure that we've at least got an opportunity to detect these threats, right? We've got visibility into the systems and data types that matter most. And we've made some simple playbooks. We've defined, the roles, accountability for our incident response team, right? It's like all of the building blocks are in place. And going back to that early theme, just building trust and confidence, like this is where we want to engage in training and ongoing exercises to make sure that we're ready, right? A security leader at a large financial organization that we work closely with, always used to tell me like training's not about today, right? It's about going from where you are today to where you want to be. But a huge challenge there is just understanding where to start. So the good news is here, you've got a whole bunch of options, right? There's all these things you can do that like ranging from things that are, minimally resource intensive up to things that are, cross-functional, can sometimes take days or weeks depending on how you set them up. So you've got a ton of options. That's good news. You've got a lot of variability in terms of like the scope and complexity of the things that you can do to start ensuring and building readiness. And I always tell everyone like doing any of these things is better than doing none, right? So we're going to talk through this like in all cases, like this is a framework, but there's no wrong way, almost no wrong way to do this, right? Meaning that if you just pick one of these like detection and response drills as an example, and you go and focus on that, taking something like Atomic Red Team, which is an open source collection of, techniques that adversaries leverage, and it really helps to make it simple to test things like your detective and preventative mechanisms. Like if you just do that and you don't do any of these other things, you're absolutely better off than you were, right? Now, what's the downside? The downside is there are a bunch of options. And you do have, you've got an opportunity there. You want to be really thoughtful about how you spend your time. You've also got not so much a downside, but you've got a focus on measurement and maturity, right? So part of having options is just kind of not diving right into these things without an understanding of how you're going to know that it's providing value and how you're going to know that you're doing it better time after time after time, right? Another challenge here too is that a lot of these, I mentioned doing something like atomic testing, doing some of it's better than doing none of it. Most of the time, you're going to engage as an organization with a couple, like some or all of these, right? It's very rare that you're going to take just one of these activities and focus on it and not do anything else. And so one of the big opportunities you have is like, you want these things, instead of just approaching them individually, like you do want to try to have some cohesion, right? And understand, how your detection and response drills or those atomic tests, like how are those relevant in the context of a tabletop drill that's focused on a particular threat or type of incident, right? So that you can, that building block analogy, taking, any one of these as a starting point and making sure that, you're bringing some cohesion to that. And as you progress, that these things have a broader purpose. So one of the ways that we look at this, and when you're kind of thinking through how you might implement some of these readiness activities, like these are the kind of the 4 R's that we always refer back to. These are just kind of like very foundational, or like really are like principles for readiness activities in general, right? You want to make sure they're relevant. We talked earlier about having a baseline threat model, and really, like, if you don't do anything else, focus on the top 2 to 3 types of threats or initial access techniques you can expect to see. Like, make these things relevant, make them realistic. So, using things like Atomic Red Team, using a breach and attack simulation tool, and writing things like your incident response plans and processes in such a way that you are training the way that you're eventually going to fight, right? You want to make these things realistic. You also want to make them like recent and repetitive, right? Meaning that when you've got an incident, it's not particularly helpful to have had one annual incident response drill 11 months ago. That's not going to build the muscle memory that you want. You're much better off doing a whole bunch of these small detection and response drills, tabletop exercises. Like, if anything, doing more of these activities with a much smaller scope more frequently, like that's going to build your muscle memory. That's going to ensure that things like, those checklists, like, not that you don't want to continue using them, but like more and more of those steps are going to be intuitive. You're going to have a better understanding of what they entail. And you're going to spend less time worried about the process of response and more time focused on the adversary and ensuring that you're mitigating that threat. And, repetitive, again, just making sure that you're doing these things over and over and over again. So what do those 4 R's look like when they're properly implemented? We tried to take those principles and all those lessons that we've learned over the years and all these things we've kind of been talking about for most of the last hour, and figure out how to implement that in a way that makes this very approachable, but also easy to measure, again, in that vein of continuous improvement, not just doing it, but making sure that you're keeping track of the fact that you're doing it, making sure whether you're doing the same thing better time after time after time. And so, when you look at how some of those are implemented and really what that looks like for like a readiness program, starting with those real world scenarios, right? Make it realistic. Taking things like, the threats that we see and that we publish month over month in our intelligence insights, right? Like focusing in on the threats and those behaviors the adversaries exhibit, the tools that they use, the techniques they leverage, and building, like using that as a starting point, right? Things like Qbot, Raspberry, Robin. And so taking these real world scenarios that are inspired by the intelligence, adversary research and investigation that we're doing day in, day out, and just putting those in a place where like those things are either in whole or in part really accessible, help you exercise those MITRE attack techniques through atomic tests, and then practice your response to those threats. Obviously, making that continuous and interactive is important, right? So making sure that you can do that, if you want to take a few minutes as you're eating lunch or as you're taking a break from other activities, once a week, right? Being able to just very quickly dive in into an interactive on-demand exercise, run those things. You can have, you can ask us or work with another partner to facilitate these. But doing these regularly, again, much more important than doing them annually or big bang, right? Minutes and hours is kind of the time commitment ideally that we're looking for. I keep measuring improvement, right? So, understand what your response to, a QBot threat is going to look like. Practice that thing once, have individuals on your team go through those drills, then go drill, work together, and just continue to revisit that over time and see what those trends look like. You could score users and you can track that progress. And most importantly, when you kind of do your post-incident review, generate actions, right? Figure out, hey, at this stage of the threat, what we really needed to do was contain an identity and contain an endpoint. But the individual responding maybe didn't have immediate access to the console they needed to do that, right? Figure out where along the way there are opportunities related to access, related to knowledge, and so forth. And really, that's maybe the most important part of all this is just understanding when you reflect on every one of these things you do, whether it's a single atomic test, and maybe you didn't have all of the defensive telemetry, all the log sources that you needed, right? Whether it's a broader threat emulation and you realize similar to that example I just gave, the individuals responding maybe don't have all the information or access they need. Understanding the specific actions you can take to do that better next time is the goal, right? Ultimately, the overarching goal here is to make sure that you're responding and not reacting. Right? Making sure that when these things take place, you feel really well prepared. You can bring a sense of calm to that incident. You can work methodically through it, and you're less prone to make mistakes that way, right? The net of that is that you're better prepared to meet the adversary. And even if they present you with something you haven't seen before, or you're not perfectly prepared for, the rest of that framework and process is in place. And it really frees you up. It kind of takes some of that pressure off, understanding and having to think consciously about what's my role and what should I do next, and being able to take that time to respond methodically and not act reactively or emotionally. So again, are we focusing on the most important things? Are those things connected, right? We've kind of talked a lot about making sure connectedness and making sure that techniques are relevant to threats that you're likely to face, and that your response plans are relevant to those threats and the way that you operate in your business. So doing that, measuring, maturing, can check out more information about readiness exercises in general. There's some information there, not just about the product, but how we think about this and a bunch of other good educational material. So to wrap up, right, those pillars of readiness: understanding the scenarios you're likely to face, making sure you've got visibility and you're going to know when an adversary shows up, knowing what to do when it happens, and then using your training and exercise cadence to just constantly drill, refine, and improve. I'll leave you with this, which is a maxim that you'll find, applied to professions like your ER, your trauma surgeon, like your special forces operator, like your first responder, and also applied to things like high-end incident response and cybersecurity teams, right? There are no shortcuts when it comes to incident, crisis, or disaster response. Organizations that prepare and train and test their response capabilities are inarguably going to be better prepared when an incident takes place. It's true in cybersecurity, and we know from the opening example, we aren't blazing new ground, right? Again, military, first responders, emergency management organizations, those are just examples of how and where readiness is ingrained in those cultures and then those professions. And the same thing is coming true in cybersecurity, right? Like as an organization, as a discipline, readiness, which is really like, not perfectly defined, right? It's very much, I'd say, like a kind of leading edge kind of concept or aspect of cybersecurity. But I think we're realizing how incredibly important it is. It is not just beneficial, it is required to predictably meet and overcome adversity and to win. So thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us today. Definitely invite you all to check out some of the resources that we've posted